Title: This paper's worth more than your empire. The rich man had a laugh, but the tables turned fast. The ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel shimmered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. The wealthiest names in the city gathered there that evening, dressed in tailored suits and glittering gowns. Waiters moved silently through the crowd carrying trays of champagne, while soft piano music floated through the air. At the center of it all stood Victor Langston, a billionaire known across America, the UK, and Canada for his ruthless business empire. Real estate, tech investments, luxury hotels, Victor owned pieces of nearly everything. And tonight, he was celebrating. The charity gala was technically meant to raise money for homeless shelters, but everyone in the room knew the truth. It was mostly a stage for Victor to showcase his power. Near the entrance, a thin elderly man stepped quietly inside the ballroom. His coat was worn, his shoes faded, and he held a small folded piece of paper in his hand as if it were the most valuable thing he owned. His name was Samuel Carter. The security guards had almost stopped him at the door, but Samuel calmly told them he had been invited. After checking the guest list, where Victor himself had written Samuel's name earlier that afternoon, they allowed him in. Samuel looked out of place among the glittering crowd. Some guests whispered, "Who invited him? Did someone lose their grandfather?" But Samuel ignored the stares and slowly walked toward Victor. At that moment, Victor was surrounded by investors and reporters. A photographer snapped pictures as Victor laughed loudly, holding a glass of champagne. "And that new tower in Manhattan will double our revenue," Victor said proudly. "We're talking billions." The crowd applauded politely. Then Samuel stepped forward. Victor noticed him and frowned slightly. "Excuse me," Samuel said gently. Victor glanced at him, clearly irritated. "Yes, can I help you?" Samuel unfolded the small paper in his hand. "I came to give this back to you," he said quietly. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Give what back?" Samuel lifted the paper. "This." Victor stared at the paper for a moment, then burst out laughing. The people around him chuckled too. "A piece of paper," Victor said mockingly. "You interrupted my event for that." Samuel remained calm. "This paper's worth more than your empire." The room fell silent. For a second, nobody moved. Then Victor laughed even louder. "More than my empire," he repeated. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Several guests smirked. One investor whispered, "This guy's crazy." Victor took the paper from Samuel's hand and held it up dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor announced, "apparently this little note is worth more than everything I own." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Victor unfolded it casually, expecting nothing more than nonsense. But the moment his eyes scanned the page, his smile disappeared. His fingers tightened around the paper. The room slowly grew quiet again. One of the reporters leaned forward. "Mr. Langston, what is it?" Victor didn't answer. Instead, his face turned pale. Because the paper was something he recognized instantly. A hospital discharge form, dated 25 years ago, and signed by a man named Samuel Carter. Victor swallowed hard. Memories rushed back like a flood. 25 years earlier, Victor had been a young entrepreneur struggling to survive. His first company had collapsed, his investors had abandoned him, and his debts were crushing him. One winter night in Chicago, he had collapsed on the street outside a small clinic. Hypothermia, exhaustion, no insurance, no money. Doctors refused to admit him. Without payment, Victor remembered lying on a bench in the freezing cold, barely conscious. And then, someone had stepped forward, a stranger, an old man, Samuel Carter. Samuel had signed the hospital papers, taking responsibility for Victor's treatment. He had even paid the first deposit from his own savings. Victor had recovered. Within months, he launched a small tech startup that eventually exploded into a billion-dollar empire. But somewhere along the way, he forgot the man who saved him. Victor slowly looked up from the paper. "You," he whispered. Samuel smiled softly. "I was wondering if you'd remember." The entire ballroom watched in confusion. Victor's voice dropped. "You paid for my treatment." Samuel nodded. "You needed help." Victor stared at him. "Why didn't you ever contact me?" Samuel shrugged gently. "You were busy building your life. I didn't want to interrupt." A reporter whispered to another, "Is this real?" Victor looked around the room, suddenly aware of the hundreds of eyes watching him. "Why bring this now?" he asked. Samuel hesitated. Then he spoke quietly. The clinic that saved you, it's closing. Victor blinked. What? Samuel nodded. They've been helping poor families for decades. But they're drowning in debt now. He looked down at the paper. That paper is the promise I made to keep helping people when I could. I thought, maybe you'd want it back. Victor's chest tightened. You're asking for money. Samuel shook his head. No. He looked Victor directly in the eyes. I'm asking you to remember who you were. The room went silent. For the first time in years, Victor Langston had no clever reply. He looked down again at the paper. Suddenly, the billions he owned felt strangely small. Across the room, someone whispered, "What's he going to do?" Victor folded the paper slowly. Then he stepped away from the crowd. He looked at Samuel. How much does the clinic need? Samuel hesitated. About 2 million. Some guests scoffed quietly. 2 million was nothing for Victor. But Victor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the stage. The microphone squealed slightly as he picked it up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly. The room quieted. Victor held up the paper. "I laughed when this man told me this paper was worth more than my empire." He paused. "But I was wrong." The reporters leaned closer. Victor looked at Samuel standing alone near the crowd. "This piece of paper represents something I lost a long time ago." Silence filled the ballroom. "Kindness," Victor said. Samuel lowered his head slightly. Victor took a deep breath. "This man saved my life when I had nothing. Tonight I stand here with everything, and somehow I forgot that." The room grew still. Victor continued. "So tonight, we're not just saving the clinic." Samuel looked up. Victor smiled slightly. "We're rebuilding it." Gasps spread through the audience. Victor raised his voice. "I'm donating $50 million to turn that clinic into a national network of free medical centers." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Reporters rushed forward. Cameras flashed. Victor stepped down from the stage and walked toward Samuel. Samuel looked stunned. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Victor handed the paper back to him. "Yes," Victor replied. "I did." Samuel looked at the paper again. Victor smiled faintly. "You were right." He glanced around the massive ballroom. "This paper really is worth more than my empire." But the night was far from over. Because in the days that followed, Victor's announcement exploded across headlines in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. People praised the generosity. But Victor knew the truth. It wasn't generosity. It was repayment. And the real twist came a week later. When Victor visited the clinic personally, he expected to see a small, struggling building. Instead, he discovered something that would change his life again. Because inside that modest clinic were hundreds of records. Each one telling the story of someone Samuel Carter had helped. Cancer patients, single mothers, homeless veterans, children needing surgery. Samuel had spent decades quietly saving lives. And never told anyone. Victor stared at the files in disbelief. "You paid for all this?" he asked. Samuel shook his head. "Not all of it." He smiled gently. "Just enough to give people a chance." Victor felt something shift deep inside him. For years he had believed success meant building the biggest empire. But now he realized something else. The smallest acts of kindness could echo across generations. Victor looked again at the paper Samuel had carried for 25 years. And for the first time in his life, Victor Langston truly understood what wealth meant. The tables had turned, not through power, not through money, but through a simple act of humanity that refused to be forgotten. And the story of that single piece of paper was only just beginning.